The Parkinson's podcast is brought to you by the Davis Phinney Foundation and brings you the stories, wisdom, and expertise of people living with Parkinson's, caregivers, and Parkinson's professionals. In this episode, Dr. Benzi Kluger, movement disorder specialist, and Kelly Weinschreider, a person living with Parkinson's, discuss the value of palliative care, aka supportive care or whole person care, from the very beginning of a Parkinson's journey. They discuss what palliative care is and isn't, the palliative care approach, how to advocate for care, where to look for care, and more.
Hello and welcome everybody. My name is Melanie Dizon. I'm the Director of Education and Content at the Davis Phinney Foundation, and I am here today with Dr. Benzi Kluger and Kelly Weinschreider. How are you guys doing today?
Good, thanks. How are you?
Good. It's great to be here. We are going to be talking about all things palliative care. To get us started, though, Dr. Benzi Kluger, I would love for you to tell us who you are, how you got involved in this work. You've been a big part of the foundation for a very long time, so it's lovely to talk to you again.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I got interested in palliative care, not by purpose. I guess there's a lot of great things in my life happened not on purpose. But I did fellowships in behavioral neurology, which is the part of neurology that deals with memory issues. And then I did another fellowship in movement disorders, which includes Parkinson's disease. And when I finished my fellowships, I thought I was going to be doing research on fatigue and neurophysiology and stuff like that. But when I got into practice and I began seeing patients not as a trainee, which meant that I was developing relationships and seeing people long-term, the diagnosis was not that interesting. Like the thrill of making a diagnosis was gone, and the reality of what a diagnosis meant was really reinforced because I was seeing people over time and getting to know them, and I was just bothered by the fact that our models of care, to me, and I think to my patients and families, just left so many important things unaddressed. And I was feeling, a bit helpless and hopeless as a physician. And I was fortunate to work at an institution that has a great palliative care program. And I was talking to Jean Kuttner, who's a leader in palliative care, about the things I was seeing and just how helpless I was feeling. And she said, you really should think about whether or how palliative care might be something that would be helpful for people with Parkinson's and other neurologic disorders. And that was, it's about 15 years ago. And I've just been, that's kind of become my life. So it was great advice. And I think palliative care really, which we'll talk about a lot, I think fills a lot of gaps that a lot of people with Parkinson's have experienced.
Sorry, that was not, I was on mute. Kelly, great. What about you? How did you get involved in this?
I'm a Parkinson's person with Parkinson's. Hold on, let me start that over. I'm a person with Parkinson's. I've lived with Parkinson's since 2002. I was diagnosed at age 29. So I've had a long journey with Parkinson's. And my father also had Parkinson's. So really my involvement or my investment in palliative care has been through working with Benzi's group. And really, I saw what my dad went through kind of in his end stages. And I thought there has to be something better than this. There has to be a better quality of life than what he went through. And I know I myself will go through it at some point. And I hope that palliative care can provide as beneficial for him. He did have a small amount, but what it did do was fantastic for him. So I'd like to see it expand more and have more people who are aware of palliative care and the benefits. And I think Benzi, Dr. Kluger, is doing a great job of getting people involved.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, I think we're going to dig into that for sure. But Benzi, can you tell us, when we say palliative care, what are we talking about? And what are some of the other words people use instead of palliative care?
Yeah, the word palliative care has become a bit charged, and we can talk about why that is. The alternative term that's often used is supportive care, but they're really equivalent. And what palliative care is, in a nutshell, is it's an approach to the care of people living with a serious illness that involves both patients and families. And the goal is simply to do what we can to improve quality of life.
Great.
And that seems pretty straightforward, but it does differ from a lot of medical care. Most medical care is in what's called a biomedical model. And so the goal of most medical care is that we want to treat a disease We may want to target specific symptoms, but it's all about biology and physiology. Palliative care is all about people.
Yeah.
And so we recognize that symptoms like pain and other things like that are important and can limit people's quality of life, but we further recognize that social isolation, feeling helpless and hopeless, trying to manage the logistics of having a serious illness and making it through our home care systems and our healthcare system, the spiritual challenges of having a serious illness, the threats to identity and in relationships, that all of those things contribute. And what in palliative care we use the term the total pain of serious illness, which just means that there's multiple dimensions of suffering that come along with an illness, not just the medical and the physiological.
Right. So Kelly, you had the experience as a care partner early on, and with your dad, and you said he had a little bit of palliative care. How was that introduced to him, and was it introduced early on?
No, it wasn't. In fact, I wish it was, and I wish I was in more of a position then than I am now to really influence him getting palliative care. It was introduced late in his care process. And it wasn't actually even introduced as palliative care. He was put in a position where he was eligible to receive what I now know as palliative care. But no, I wish it would have been offered much, much sooner. And I wish I had known that that was a possibility, because it could have saved us a lot of time and made him much more comfortable through the latter stages of Parkinson's.
Right. And then as somebody who was also diagnosed with Parkinson's, did you get any education on palliative care early on? And if not, what do you see that people are getting wrong about it?
No, I did not receive any education on palliative care. And I think, I'm a part of a number of different support groups. And whenever I've mentioned it, I'm so excited about it. And I think, this is great. People should be getting it. But everybody compares it to hospice. They say, I don't want that. That's you're putting me in the late stages. And I try to explain that it may be considered that from way back when, but it's not your father's palliative care. It's not your father's hospice. It's palliative care. And, and it's for any stage, and it helps you through various stages of a chronic illness. And I think that's, what I've tried to convey to people, but I think that they get hung up on the hospice aspect of it.
Yeah, I think that's sort of natural, because we've done a not great job of doing it. And also because it has typically been offered later, much later. So there's proximate cause of hospice and palliative care. People make that link, right? That it's a late stage. So Benzi, can you talk to us a little bit about what would palliative care look like for somebody that is Kelly's age? She was 29 years old. And what would that conversation be, if there would be a conversation? And if not, then when would it happen?
Yeah, let me clarify one other thing also before moving ahead, that palliative care, when we use the term, and this is another area where things get confusing, it is an approach to care. And one aspect of that approach is hospice. So hospice is palliative care and specialist palliative care for people who are nearing the end of their life. There is specialist palliative care, and I run a neuropalliative care clinic at the University of Rochester, and there's other specialist neuropalliative care clinics. But the palliative care approach is something that any physician, any neurologist can and should consider integrating into the care they provide. And I say that as a caveat because I think the palliative care approach needs to start at the time of diagnosis. And for me, it was a humbling and eye-opening thing as I started to do research in this area. I think Kelly can, it's not going to be a surprise to her, but it was a surprise to me of how devastating getting a diagnosis of Parkinson's disease is. As a neurologist, I've now used these words that I have a relativity bias, that giving someone a diagnosis of Parkinson's to me as a neurologist is relatively good news. It's better than brain cancer, it's better than ALS, it's better than multiple system atrophy, but it's not good news to the individual receiving that diagnosis. And so for me, hearing about people getting the diagnosis, the emotional turmoil it put them in, the impact it had on their social relations, and thinking about disability and planning for the future, all of those many aspects that take people years to sort out on their own without support, that's when palliative care starts. And that approach doesn't have to be seeing a palliative care specialist. It could be that there's a social worker that's integrated into the clinic. It could be that we have better peer support. It could be that we have group classes. so that people can identify and find people who are going through similar things. So it's really thinking about when, how do we start this approach, not when should it start and who should get it, because I think everybody should get their care that's informed by this approach. It's just what's the best model for where people are at various stages of their illness.
Yeah, so that brings me to the question about you live and you used to be in Colorado, where there was a center here. Now you're in Rochester, there's a center there, and you have a comprehensive approach to caring for people with Parkinson's movement disorders. What types of people can provide palliative care? And my sense is that there's probably palliative approach to care being given in lots of different ways. If your doctor recommends you maybe see a social worker or somebody, but they're not calling it that, right? Like I went to see a social worker. They're not saying I'm getting palliative care. So who are the different types of providers?
Yeah, there's a few options, and it kind of depends on what you need. I guess I can start, if we almost envision it as a pyramid, in terms of the kind of the intensity and urgency of need, that kind of the most intensive and urgent needs would be seeing either a neuropalliative specialist like myself or a clinic like that, or palliative care or palliative medicine specialists who often see people with non-cancer diagnoses and can provide an extra layer of support and help. I would say if we kind of go down below that there's going to be people who are needing extra support, but may not need to see a palliative care specialist. And so that could be, getting extra help from a pain specialist. It could be seeing a psychologist or a social worker or a chaplain, maybe outside of a palliative care team, to address some of these issues. Some of it can be met, but through support groups. Some of it could be met through kind of reconnecting with your own spiritual care community. And then, kind of almost at the foundation is going to be your regular healthcare team. And so neurologists, we're actually in the midst of a project right now with the Parkinson's Foundation, where we're trying to get, and this is how me and Kelly began working together, is that we're really trying to get every neurologist and every center of excellence in the Parkinson's Foundation network to integrate the palliative care approach into the care they provide. And so that is trying to get movement disorder specialists, among other things, to recognize that Parkinson's disease diagnosis is not good news, and that we need to change the way we make the diagnosis, but including that we need to be comprehensive and systematic about screening for things like pain and fatigue and sleep and depression that oftentimes fall between the cracks, and making sure that we have, even if they're not in-house, that we have connections to the kinds of resources that people will need when issues come up. And I would say really the base and the foundation of the pyramid is patients and families themselves. And so as I've been thinking more about palliative care and the palliative care approach, I think the person on the healthcare team, although we don't usually think about them on the healthcare team, that's going to be the most invested, the best position to drive this model of care is going to be the patient and the family. And the way patients and families can do that is by, like with this webinar, getting educated about what the palliative care approach is, and then using that to prepare themselves for visits so that they can get that type of care. So that could mean, coming in with a list of the non-motor symptoms that you want to address. It could be coming in with a question prompt list of, I really want to know more about my future and I want to have a roadmap, and I know that everybody's different, but I want to know what's the best case scenario, what's the worst case scenario, what's most likely, so that people can really get the most out of those doctor visits. And part of that is I think that I think is a good model for care. Part of it is, and we're learning this, is that the availability of palliative care is pretty patchy across the country. It's definitely better than it was when I started 10 years ago, but it's definitely not where we would want it to be. And so, it's not unlikely that you may be in an area where there is not a specialty clinic. You may be in an area where the palliative care doctors are only seeing patients with cancer or don't have a lot of comfort with Parkinson's. You might be in an area where your neurologist really hasn't been educated on this approach, and there is, I think, room for some grassroots activism to, for patients and families to kind of drive this approach to care and to demand this type of care.
Yeah. So when we say palliative approach, and you're looking at it from a holistic level, and what's the opposite of that? Like how might somebody know, oh, my doctor is not on the same page? What are they focusing on?
Kelly, do you want to address that from your experience?
Well, I think from my experience and just listening to Benzi chat a little bit about what his feelings are on palliative care, I would say as a patient, for me, and I've been at this a long time, is that it especially as a young patient that didn't fit the norm for Parkinson's, finding my care team, finding that common ground with the different specialists I needed, I did it all myself. And I had to. I mean, I had to climb that mountain myself. And I, through support groups, have educated people on how to do it. But I think having some kind of resource, somebody available to help me figure that out, and having a service like palliative care that, as Benzi said, ideally would be available at the time of diagnosis and that could kind of help you through the different stages, would really, I think, be valuable to any patient. And I think that's part of why I like the palliative care approach.
Yeah. So you say that you help a lot of people in your support group advocate for this type of care. What are some of the things that you share with them? What are some actions that people can take?
Well, I think it's, we've talked a lot about, checklists, people, either doctors offering them or having a patient checklist that can be provided, to people in support groups. I think just acknowledging that there are lots of symptoms that are visible. There's many, many more symptoms that are not visible, and to be aware of those things, that people don't have to suffer with something that there is remedy for, but they don't even know it exists within the Parkinson's world. And so I think that that's a big part of it, is just spreading awareness of what Parkinson's is and what it is not. And I think just even things like advanced care planning, things that look towards the future that, normally that's not part of a doctor's appointment. And I think that those things are very critical in just helping you to feel more secure about your future.
To build on what Kelly said, I would say, again, from our research and interviews with people living with Parkinson's, I think the opposite of palliative care, which people get to various degrees, is care that's really focused on the disease. It's focused around medications, and that people, feel like that, they don't get much in the way of guidance about the future. There's not a lot of interest in who they are as a person and in the way it's impacting them as a person. And then people kind of go outside the medical system for advanced care planning, for example. The majority of people that we interviewed didn't think their doctor would be interested in this and have worked on it with lawyers. And while lawyers can help with some aspects of it, I think there is at minimum a need for good medical input. And I've reviewed many advanced care plans. We can talk more about that and what that is, that were done by lawyers, and they're, oftentimes 10 pages long. They don't make medical sense. If you call 911, the paramedics are not going to open a safe to look through this 10-page document to figure out what to do. And so I think, again, we've kind of got to change and advance our culture of care, so that these things are routine and standard. And that's something that I tell a lot of people in a lot of, different aspects is that, if you have cancer and you go to a cancer center, these things are routine. So the standard of care is you're going to get advanced care planning, you're going to have a chaplain, you're going to have a social worker, you're going to have a summer camp for your kids, there's going to be support groups and stuff like that. And I don't think people are fully on board with, just how impactful an illness like Parkinson's disease is, and how much of a need there is for similar support. So that's kind of like, my mindset in terms of a lot of the work that I'm doing is, can we, within the next 5 years, 10 years, really advance Parkinson's care and advanced care at Parkinson Centers of Excellence, but even outside of it, so that this is, routine, that people just accept that, this is what patients with Parkinson's should expect, that anything less than that is substandard.
Right. Yeah, I definitely want to talk about some of the advanced care planning, and we might get to that with this question, but can you share, I think a lot of people are still going to be saying, well, like, what does it look like for me? So can you share maybe a couple of case studies of people that you've worked with that have been part of the palliative care approach from time of diagnosis, and what might people be surprised about in seeing, what they went through, and then maybe some of the people that are sort of more typical, maybe they were diagnosed much later in life and they had a different experience with palliative care.
Yeah, I could give you a few kind of scenarios, and again, we can kind of start, from the beginning, middle, and and later stages of Parkinson's. So I think one of, a patient who I still remember really well and was really influential to me in terms of the kind of care I provide was a woman. She was in her mid-40s when she was diagnosed. She had 2 children who were still in grade school. She was working, and and it was clear to me. I was very early in my journey. I think I was just starting to get the palliative care clinic off the ground. But it was clear to me that she, had good reason to be sad, that she was experiencing grief. She had not an anxiety disorder. She had normal worry. And that, that the best thing that I could do at that time, would be to, connecting to our social worker and our chaplain and counseling, help her to, figure out how to tell her kids about this, help her to have a game plan for the future, help her to talk about how to tell her work about this, to provide her with some concrete guidance about how and when to manage disability. So that's, and I guess the other thing I would say with our clinic or other palliative care is like, depending on the person in the day, I may or may not be the most important person on the team. Sometimes it's the social worker is the most important. Sometimes it's the chaplain. Sometimes it's our nurse. So it varies. So that's one example. Like I get a lot of referrals to our clinic for people with Parkinson's who are struggling with pain and helping them with pain and other symptom management. And that can happen at any time along the course of the illness. We are starting a program right now, and in Colorado, there's a program off the ground of palliative care being involved in DBS, deep brain stimulation, which I think is surprising to some people until you start to talk about what's involved. One is that, before you're having anything stuck in your brain, you might want to talk about your future wishes because we hope it goes well, but it may not. We want to talk about expectations. For some people who don't have a care partner or a lot of support, we want to talk about how do we support them through this intensive process and hospital stay. So really providing people with an extra layer of support during a pretty intensive and momentous thing. And I bring up DBS in particular because, again, because of people's association with hospice and cancer, the idea is that you have to give things up to get palliative care. And we can talk more about hospice, and there are, situations where I think we need to change policy, but there are situations in the United States where people do need to make tough choices around hospice. But for palliative care, there's not a good reason why people would have to, choose one over the other. And then I certainly do get involved with people who are kind of more the traditional palliative care patient who are, may have advanced Parkinson's, they may have dementia. They and their family have goals that they'd like to avoid hospitals. They'd like to spend as much time at home as possible. They need extra caregiver support, and that's certainly a very appropriate and traditional use of palliative care teams.
Okay, so how does somebody who is interested in palliative care or just the palliative care approach speak to their primary care doctor about it, whether it's just a primary care doctor, a general neurologist, or a movement disorder specialist?
Yeah, so for asking about specialist palliative care, they can ask for a referral, and I would anticipate, depending on where they're at in their illness, that their doctor might tell them that they don't have to worry about that yet. That happens a lot. So I give, as you know, I give talks about this frequently, and I talk to support groups, and then people are excited. They love this approach. They go back to their doctor, and their doctor is like, "Oh, you don't need that." And so I say that because people need to be prepared for it. And this gets part of to the grassroots education is to say, I actually am interested in palliative care, and I'm interested in it because I really would like to talk to someone more about a roadmap for what's ahead. I'd really like some extra support for my pain and some other symptoms, or whatever aspects of those needs happen to be. So that's important. For the palliative care approach, it gets back to the kind of the role of the patient and the family member as activists, and in that context, you can try to activate your doctor's ability to do palliative care by saying, these are the things I want to cover today. I'd really like to focus more on my pain than my tremor today. I'd like to talk about advanced care planning. I'd like to know more about what resources there might be for care partner support. And it's possible that your doctor would be able to help you with that. And if they can't, then it's fair to ask for a referral. So you might ask for a referral to a physiatrist or a pain specialist, or you might ask for a referral to a social worker or a counselor.
Great. So if somebody does ask for a referral, and whether that be to a palliative center, a palliative care center, or just another practice, let's say, and maybe there's another doctor in the area who specializes in palliative care, happens to have a, understanding of Parkinson's and palliative care. When you move that to that doctor, does that mean you lose your current doctor?
No, it doesn't. And actually, as you're saying that, one thing that people also may want to be prepared for. So you want to be prepared for your doctor saying, no, you're not ready for that. The other thing you may want to be prepared for is then they don't know who to send it to.
Mm-hmm.
And so, to Kelly's point, like, unfortunately these days, I mean, you'll get better care if you do your homework. And so if you do some research and you find out that there's a supportive care clinic or next step clinic or palliative care clinic at the University of Rochester or whatever, that you could say, well, actually, I'm interested in this particular clinic. I'd like a referral there, and some of the services they provide really speak to the needs that I have.
Yeah, and so you could technically go there, but then you can still see that doctor.
Absolutely, yeah. For palliative care, you don't lose anything. You gain an extra layer of support. Hospice is a little trickier. So for hospice, technically, whoever is your hospice attending is going to be the only doctor on your team that is paid from that point forward. And so it is possible that your neurologist or your primary care provider could be an attending for you on hospice. It's also possible that your neurologist or primary care provider can stay involved with your care and be a consultant. But you would, when you are transitioning to hospice, those are tough choices. Other tough choices that I think are unfair, and that, if I was in charge of the country, I would change, is that, there are some treatments like the Duopa pump that are expensive that hospice won't cover.
Mm-hmm.
And so people may have to delay hospice because of that. Most hospices won't cover physical therapy or occupational therapy, which makes a little bit of sense for cancer. It doesn't make a lot of sense for Parkinson's. But again, when I'm working with patients, like we figure out ways to juggle and work around the system, because the system's really not optimally set up. But with hospice, there are these kinds of trade-offs that we need to, kind of wrestle with. But for palliative care, there's fortunately not.
It's worth it to dig and to do the research and to see what's available and see what's going to happen, because it's obviously one person's hospice experience is not everyone's hospice experience. So good to know that.
Let me speak two things to that. And I wrote a blog on my blog, benzikluger.com, about that, which was actually is asked Dr. Benzi question about someone with Parkinson's who was having a bad hospice experience. And I would, two things is that not all hospices are created equal. And even within a hospice, not all hospice nurses are equal.
Mm-hmm.
And so sometimes even within a hospice, you can advocate for yourself for possibly a different nurse. There may be more than one hospice serving your area. And part of why the International Neuropalliative Care Society was put together was to try to educate hospice providers about Parkinson's. Because there's also a gap there that most hospice providers come from internal medicine. They're very comfortable with cancer. They don't know as much about, in general, I mean, some do, but they don't in general know as much about Parkinson's. And so there definitely is a need for advocacy and for education there to make the hospice experience better for people living with Parkinson's. So, I mean, there's good care out there, and I think there's also a lot of opportunities to make it better.
So when you worked with this woman and you were talking about, end of life planning and that kind of thing, how does that look different when you do it versus when an attorney does it? What are some of the differences you've seen?
Yeah. So what I would say, and this could be at any stage, but one big difference is that when I'm talking about advanced care planning with a patient, it's based on my experiences and my knowledge as a medical provider. Whereas I think, it's not always the case, but I think a lot of times the case is that, for patients and families and for attorneys, for people who are not in the medical profession, it's often informed by television. To be blunt about it, that people have ideas about, CPR and things like that are based on television shows. And on television, 90% of people get better. Many people will go on to date their nurse or have psychic powers or go back to fighting crime. But, in the real world, the statistics are very different. And in the real world, it's maybe 5 or 10% of people, if you're lucky, who get back to anything resembling their prior life. And part of the reason I actually am pushing the kind of the field and the concept of neuropalliative care is that, even beyond just palliative care, I think it's important that the person who has these conversations with you has a deep and an intimate knowledge of your specific illness and has an idea of how long and how well you're likely to live with Parkinson's, and can tell you, how long and how well you're likely to live if you were to have a cardiac arrest or you were to have a serious pneumonia or something like that. As one example, of an area where it's often different is that if I'm thinking, if I'm seeing that patient who I mentioned last who has advanced Parkinson's and dementia, part of our conversation is going to be, what would a hospital stay look like for your loved one? Are they likely to return home? How much suffering are they likely to endure? And is that consistent with our goals at this point? So it's not simply filling out a piece of paper, but it's really thinking through, what are your values? What do I know about Parkinson's from experience? And how can we try to come up with a plan where you're going to have the least regrets possible, knowing that, I don't have a crystal ball. But I know enough to provide some guidance and to help people make better decisions.
Right. So 2 questions. And the first one is, I don't think we covered this yet. Does insurance typically cover palliative care? Is there at any point where it's, no, you're too early, or we're not covering this, or?
Yeah. So insurance does cover palliative care. Also, important to know is that all insurances also cover hospice. Mm-hmm. Hospice has restrictions. So in the United States, to be eligible for hospice, you need to have a life expectancy of 6 months or less. And even that, I would say is a little bit loose. And I don't know if we're planning on talking more about hospice, but almost anytime I tell patients about hospice, I let them know that, if you qualify for hospice, we should think about hospice in terms of your goals and in terms of what services you might be able to get from it. And then if you qualify for it, then let's take advantage of that, rather than as there's nothing more to do. So let's do hospice and let's just focus on the prognosis. My record holder for hospice was on hospice for 6 years. And wow. I think hospice actually was why she lived for 6 years, because without hospice, she would have been in and out of the hospital. Mm-hmm. And she wouldn't have, this was actually a younger woman with Huntington's disease. I don't think she would have had the benefit of being able to be cared for at home with her very tough and stubborn and loving German mother.
So she was actually in a care facility in hospice.
No, she was at home. She
okay. But she had she was able to.
Hospice allowed her to stay at home.
Yeah. Okay.
If it wasn't for hospice, I think she would have, my suspicion is that she probably would have lived 6 weeks, and that she probably would have died at her next hospital stay. But the care and extra support that hospice provided allowed her to stay at home. And that made all the difference for her. And we've had, some patients who have graduated from hospice who really do better when we shift the goals of care to staying at home, avoiding doctors, avoiding hospitals, focusing on what's most important. And people do well, and then they no longer qualify for hospice, which is its own kind of stupidity. But nonetheless, it happens. But to go back to your original question, for other palliative care outside of hospice, there are no restrictions. And people seeing me, they pay a copay or whatever, just like seeing any other doctor or specialist. So for that, there's not an issue. The last thing I would say, though, with the finances of it, and this is, something that we're dealing with in the U.S., is that for some aspects of palliative care, hospitals and hospital systems struggle to figure out how to make it work as a business plan. I can bill for my services, but chaplains can't. Social workers, we have to be creative for how to pay. But that being said, if palliative care is available, then it's available and it'll get covered by your insurance. And it's up to me and other clinics and people like that to try to be creative in our business plans to be able to provide the care that we know people want and deserve.
Right. So Kelly, can you share, that was a question, and Kelly, you could probably speak to this, but what are some of the providers that you've actually seen, that might go beyond what the general people with Parkinson's might see?
Do you mean in terms of specialists, or how do you mean?
Or any of the sort of comprehensive care that you've gotten? And you said pain, Benzi, do people see physical therapists and work through pain in that way? Like, what are all the different ways?
Well, just from my perspective, I know my dad saw a physiatrist for pain. He went to rehab, physical therapy. I've seen any number of specialists, from a urogynecologist to a gastroenterologist to a neuro-ophthalmologist. Sorry, I'm just thinking about.
That's okay.
What else there is. There's just so many.
Yeah. And did it feel like a real up-leveling of your quality of life when you were getting that kind of care?
Oh, most definitely. I mean, I think I've been fortunate to find doctors through different searches and through, meeting different people that have known about Parkinson's. And I think that's where people struggle, is you get specialists like a GI specialist that doesn't understand Parkinson's and doesn't understand what happens in the GI system with Parkinson's, and people don't get treated the appropriate way. I've been very fortunate to find a doctor in Chicago that does research on the gut for Parkinson's. It runs in his family, so he understands it. And I have benefited so greatly from his care. And I think that that's really important, but it's hard to find. It's very, very difficult to find specialists that, you need to be seen and you need to have certain things treated, because Parkinson's involves the entire body. But it's difficult if they don't understand Parkinson's or don't even relate it to Parkinson's when, it's one of the symptoms. Right. So that level of education and people finding the right doctors is critical. It's just very difficult to do.
Yeah. And I would suspect, and I could be totally wrong about this, but that if there are these specialists that are, specialists in another area like the gut, but they happen to have expertise in Parkinson's, that they actually know other people who are not Parkinson's experts, but know about Parkinson's, right? So they can provide referrals and they can say, oh, you should see this neuro-ophthalmologist, right? Like, I know that this is going on. This is definitely not the case for a lot of people who are piecing this together themselves. Right. And so what advice do you have for them if somebody is living in, a state that is, everything is all over the place and they might have to drive far, and the best way that how and that you've seen from your research, Benzi, is for them to communicate with each other and to sort of be on the same page. Kelly, what advice would you offer to people with Parkinson's who are in that situation?
That's a great question. And I think, for me, I volunteer a lot throughout the Parkinson's world. And so I've met a lot of people across the country, and I've utilized some of those resources for people. I've had referrals. I've gotten people in like, for instance, in my support group in Chicago, I invite people from all over the country to participate. And so we talk a lot about the specialist care and help people find ways to find doctors. But again, it's very difficult because people don't, if you're a GI specialist, you don't advertise typically that you're a Parkinson's, you have Parkinson's knowledge. So it's a lot of it's word of mouth. But yeah, I think that there's an opportunity there to help advertise or to help and educate people as to these people are the specialists you should be seeing. And we try to do that as best we can as patients.
Yeah. Benzi, has telehealth had any impact on the palliative care approach and the ability to provide that service to more people with Parkinson's? Yeah,
it has. I think, not that COVID was a good thing for the world, but COVID too, I guess silver linings that came out of it. One is telehealth. And for palliative care, that has been a good thing because it's allowed us to see more patients, people who traditionally may not be able to make it to clinic. I was going to add to Kelly's point that something that I do, and I think other people do, is that, if you're able to establish care at a tertiary care center like the University of Rochester, University of Colorado, that you might see that team once a year, you might see them by telehealth, and they might help coordinate care where you're living. And so I'm right now, when I was in Colorado, I saw people all over the state and in Wyoming, and here too, I'm seeing people from a wide geographic area. And sometimes that's part of my role, is just to be an extra set of eyes and to let people know, hey, I think this actually isn't a time where you would want to see a gastroenterologist who has, a little bit of extra knowledge, or that I reach out to their local gastroenterologist and say, hey, for Parkinson's disease, things are different. And maybe we should try doing things in this way.
Yeah. And that is a very good reason to start this process of the palliative care approach and seeking it out early. I think for a lot of people, they might get diagnosed young and they've got a lot going on, and it's actually the perfect time for them to be able to travel to somewhere and get, care sort of set up somewhere, but it's the least likely because they say, I'm all great, I don't need it. And this could be one of those instances where we say, hey, when you get diagnosed, this is a really important piece and it's going to follow you through your whole care. Take the time to travel to Rochester or Colorado or somewhere else, that San Francisco, where there's a, palliative care center, and you can, begin getting care from them and then maybe working through telehealth over time. But I think hopefully that more education is going to mitigate some of that fear of palliative care and think that it's something that it's not, and understand how much better their quality of life can be as a result.
Well, and just to add to that, I think at diagnosis time or close to diagnosis time, that's when people are probably, you're right, probably less likely to get that type of care, but it's the time that they need it the most.
Mm-hmm.
They're alone, and no matter what age they are, they're alone, they feel alone. And if you don't have that support team and you don't have the guidance from the get-go, you're likely to not fare as well in the future because you just don't have that level of support, and you don't know who to see for different aspects of the motor and non-motor care.
Right. And I just think, as much as we want to say that it's try to redefine palliative care so that people understand it in a different way, it's still a word that people don't want to say, I'm going to get palliative care, or I'm going to my palliative care center. And so I think we have work to do. It's certainly work that's we're capable of doing. But in the Parkinson space, we want to make sure that people are getting it much earlier. What sort of palliative care services are often provided or can be provided to care partners?
I don't know, Kelly, if you'd like to start with your experiences as a care partner.
Yeah, I think, from a palliative care standpoint, when we received it, it was late in the process. My dad had a fall and was recovering from the fall. And so he was given medications to help him work through the pain, work through some psychosis that he had. So it was not hospice. It was, the intent was to keep him, comfortable and keep him, hopefully for him to get better and for him to, thrive. And unfortunately, that did not happen, and he went to hospice. But I can see the value of it. Had it happened soon, had the process of palliative care happened earlier, he might not have had the fall. He might, I think there was a lot more opportunity in hindsight for us to manage his care. I don't say so much for us, my mom and myself, but for us to have somebody to help us, guide us through his, final couple of years. I think that would have been very, very valuable.
I could add from my experiences. So when I'm talking to care partners, the question I always ask people is what's the toughest aspect of this for you? And the answers that I get vary, and it speaks to the different things that we can offer in palliative care. I would say probably the most common is that the toughest part of this for me is seeing my loved one suffer and not being able to change that.
Yeah.
And so, and really speaking to, the emotional aspects of being a care partner. And so along those lines, our chaplains or other counselors can try to provide some additional support. I would say, probably the second most common answer is it's overwhelming trying to juggle everything. I've got doctor's appointments and I'm trying to get home care and I'm trying to do this and that, and I have no time for myself and my own appointments. And that's something where I think in particular our social workers really excel in trying to help people connect them to the resources. And I would say my mindset, and I think Kelly speaks to this well, is that like Kelly, I'd like to start palliative care as early as possible. It's much easier to prevent someone from burning out than to unburn them out. And so if we're able to get to a patient and a family earlier and really provide that support, get them help at home, give people a good roadmap so they don't burn themselves out, it makes for a much better experience for everybody. Kelly, you're about to...
I think that's what happened with my mother. Is I think she burned out and she was on the very verge of hurting herself and trying to help my dad. And so my dad ended up in a nursing facility, which was not ideal for him or us. but she was jeopardizing her own health. And so I think had we had better understanding of what was available to keep him at home or to keep him safe. And I would say his primary complaint, just specific to him, was pain. And we really, really struggled with finding somebody to help him through the pain. That would probably have been had you asked him that would have been his answer, was getting through the pain.
Yeah.
Benzi, can you talk a little bit about what obviously you both are involved in helping centers of excellence get the kind of care that we need, but you're also involved in the INPCS. Can you talk a little bit about that, how it came to be and what you're working on?
Sure. Actually, one thing to follow up on your last point too, and actually I think a few of your other questions about what we call it, is that I think for the patient and the family, it's important to be clear on what your needs are. And there are a lot of centers and there's a lot of providers who can meet those needs, and they may not call what they're doing palliative care. And I think there are great providers at a number of centers. There's great providers in the community who I think are naturally oriented to this palliative and person-centered approach and can help you. So I would say that you don't have to demand palliative care. I think it is important to state what your needs are and say, I need help coming to terms with this diagnosis. I need help with X, Y, or Z. I'd like a social worker to help, but that may not be under the umbrella of palliative care. So just with that caveat, but to switch gears, so the International Neuropalliative Care Society, came up really out of a broader need as I was getting more into, developing palliative care for people with Parkinson's and seeing people also with brain cancer and with dementia and Lou Gehrig's disease. I think from a palliative care standpoint that things were more similar than different. And what I was finding is that there were a number of people who would be helpful for helping us advance the field. So there's neurologists like myself, there are people in the world of palliative medicine, there's geriatricians, there's social workers, there's chaplains, there's patients and family advocates like Kelly. And at that time, there was no place where people like that would all get together and talk about this. So at the American Academy of Neurology meeting, there was a special interest group for palliative care. At the American Academy of Hospice and Palliative Medicine, there was a special interest group for neurology. But there was really no place where this was the main course and where people were really getting together and spending, the whole meeting to talk about, these really important things. So that was the impetus for the International Neuropalliative Care Society. And we've been, from the get-go, you've had some values and principles that have been driving our work. One is that we're going to get farther faster if we get all of the stakeholders at the table. And so it's really important for us that patients and families and disease societies like the Davis Phinney Foundation and researchers and clinicians, get together and talk about these things so that we're not all reinventing the wheel and that we can figure out, what are the best models to move this forward faster. A second big thing is doing that on an international level. So I've learned a ton from my international colleagues. And I think, again, we'll move forward faster, but part of it is that a lot of these things intersect with policy. And I think we've hinted at this a little bit, that the way hospice works in the United States is not the way hospice works in Canada. And the way home care works in the US is not the way it works in Canada. And we found actually in one of our studies that care partners, people with Parkinson's, were doing better in Canada than they were in the United States before we started our randomized controlled trial. And I think the important lesson from that is that we in the United States have a lot to learn about how we care for family members of people with a serious illness. And so that's been a really important thing. And I think the last value that I would share that I think is really important is that we're really intentional about changing and transforming care, that we really want to be practical. And I think in particular, and this has been true of my whole career, is that when we get patients and family members in the room, we get a sense of urgency, and it helps us to focus on what's most important. And it's not about publishing papers, and it's not about research grants. It's about how, what's the best way forward to figure out how to improve care.
Yeah, actually, you just reminded me that about care partners, and we're talking about the family. And when you do care partners get the same services, well, obviously not the same services, but do they have access to a lot of the services in terms of counseling and chaplain and all that kind of, great service that providers offer? Yeah.
Yeah, they do. One of the things that I say a lot and that resonates with people is that an illness like Parkinson's doesn't just affect one person.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a very incomplete model of care if we're only focusing care on one person. And depending on where I'm catching a patient and a family during their illness course, a lot of times we spend more time, with the care partner. And in fact, in people with advanced Parkinson's or dementia, we might ask them how things are going. They're like, things are fine. and the care partner is in the corner ripping their hair out saying, no, they're everything but fine. So that's really a core principle in palliative care is that we do provide care for the family, and get back to one of your earlier questions. I mean, that's a big difference in models of care, and most models of care do not extend care to family members, but palliative care that's essential to the work that we do.
Kelly, did you have experience as, getting services as a care partner with your father or somebody else in your family? And then anything with the care partners in your life now? Well,
I think with my dad, I kind of led his care. So while I wasn't necessarily offered any services as a care partner, I had to laugh when Benzi said that, the person with advanced Parkinson's said, yeah, everything's great, because it's exactly what my dad did. And so I had to speak on his behalf, because he couldn't voice, or he couldn't tell the provider what the issue was. And so if he had gone alone, or with my mom, he'd walk out of there with nothing. So I really led his care as a care partner, but I also was diagnosed before him, so I had a lot of experience where most care partners do not. What was the rest of your question? I apologize.
No, I just didn't know if anybody in your life as a care partner or close family member is getting care as you're getting care.
No, but I think my husband, he knows that there's opportunities out there for him. And we do have some support groups that have care partners that attend, but quite frankly, I don't think we've needed that to this point in my disease course, but I think he knows that those options are available in the future for him.
Yeah, that's great. And Benzi, you have a conference coming up?
Yes. Yeah. Thanks for asking us about that. So we have the International Neuropalliative Care Society. We're having our first in-person meeting. There'll also be a hybrid option if people can attend in person, but it'll be September 12th to the 15th in Minneapolis. We're actually fortunate, and again, not because of good planning on my part, but the Davis Phinney Foundation will be there in Minneapolis at the same time. And we're actually very excited about one of the offerings at the meeting is going to be a pre-meeting workshop for patients and families on self-advocacy and activism. And so a lot of the things that we talk about, we'll spend all day, we'll have an 8-hour day to talk about, how do you incorporate these concepts into your own care? And we'll spend part of the day talking about how can we help change medical culture? How can I, as a patient or family member who cares deeply about this model of care, be a voice for change?
Wow, that's exciting. That's very exciting. Okay, so thank you, Dr. Kluger and Kelly, so much for being here today and talking to us about palliative care, supportive care, all of the different services that are provided and that people can check out, whether it's called palliative care in their area or not. And we hope that through education, people can start to get this type of care earlier in the process so they can live better and much longer with Parkinson's. So thank you so much.
Thanks for having us, and actually thank the Davis Phinney Foundation for everything that they're doing to forward this model of care.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Parkinson's Podcast. For more information about the Davis Phinney Foundation and to learn about educational offerings and community events for people living with Parkinson's, please visit davisphinneyfoundation.org or dpf.org.